topic is the question of syllabic consonants. Why does this belong here? Well, because syllabic consonants occur only in weak syllables. They never occur in stressed syllables. And according to my analysis, syllabic consonants all consist really of a schwa, together with a liquid or a nasal. So, in a word like sudden, we have two syllables, sudden. But arguably, this represents the sequence sudden. Indeed, it is possible to say sudden, though you risk sounding childish or foreign if you say sudden or suddenly instead of sudden and sudden. With syllabic M, we certainly have a very free choice between blossom or blossom, whether the is there overtly or not. Is it medal or is it medal? Well, for me it's got to be the second, medal, but there are people who say medal. In a word such as gathering, where we get an R link before the following ing suffix, we have the option of turning into and saying gathering, gathering. Of course, in American English, words like father, American pronunciation corresponding to my father, I would apply the same analysis. That's a and an but they are pronounced simultaneously. Now, the point is that we retain the syllables. Sudden still has two syllables, even with syllabic M. Blossom still has two syllables. Medal still has two syllables. Gathering, so pronounced, still has three syllables. That's why we call these syllabic consonants. So I see this as a kind of superficial phonetic phenomenon, but underneath, underlying as we say, we have a weak schwa vowel which coalesces phonetically with the following nasal or L. Well, that's then relevant to the next topics we have to discuss. I want to look at two further phenomena which involve weak vowels, and only weak vowels. And the first of these is the phenomenon which I call compression. In many words in English, we have a choice about the number of syllables we pronounce. A choice in the sense that the speaker can freely choose whether to say lenient as 3 syllables or lenient as 2 syllables. It really doesn't matter at all. It may depend upon stylistic factors. You can say influence, 3 syllables, influence, or you can compress it to 2 syllables, influence. You can say prisoner, 3 syllables, or you can say prisoner, 2 syllables. You can say it was rattling around, 3 syllables, rattling, or you can say rattling, rattling around, 2 syllables. You can ask, what's your preference, 3 syllables, or you can ask, what's your preference, 2 syllables. So this is a phenomenon that's found in many languages, whereby I and U lose their syllabicity before another vowel and become the corresponding semivowel. But it also applies in English to syllabic consonants, which in exactly the same position lose their syllabicity and can become non-syllabic. But generally the uncompressed version, that's the slow version, is more usual in rarer words, in slow or deliberate speech, and the first time a word occurs in a discourse. But the compressed version, the rapid version, is more usual in frequently used words, in fast or casual speech, and if the word has already been used in the discourse. So people who don't talk about history very much would call it history. Here we have a department of history, they always call it history, because it's a word they use all the time. Both pronunciations are correct. Now, you can see that the process of syllabic consonant formation and then compression, what we've got now, the two together add up to the same thing as schwa elision. So if you've got a word like preference, you start off with preference, write it down. Preference. We then have syllabic consonant formation, which makes it preference. And we then have compression that removes the syllabicity and gives preference. And all three are acceptable pronunciations of this word. Notice the consequences here. Now, one very important restriction in English is that you get compression only before a weak vowel. Only before a weak vowel. Again, this is why it's relevant to define what the weak vowels are. You may know that the suffix spelled ate is strong in verbs, but weak in adjectives. So the verb is to separate. We've got to separate these two things. But the adjective is separate, with or some people it, which is therefore a candidate for compression, giving separate. There, we keep them separately from one another, separately, separate. We can compress there, but we couldn't say separate instead of separate. The verb to moderate must keep three syllables always, to moderate, but the adjective moderate can compress to moderate, moderately well. Compression only before weak vowels. Now, speakers of Spanish, this is why English behaves strangely, from the Spanish point of view, in Spanish loanwords. We have borrowed the words fiesta and siesta from Spanish. In Spanish, they're pronounced as two syllables each. Fiesta, siesta. In English, they're pronounced as three syllables. Fiesta, fiesta, siesta. Why? Because the e is a strong vowel. It has the stress. And we can't compress before a strong vowel. The Spanish city of Santiago, in Spanish, has three syllables. Santiago. In English, how many syllables does it have? 4. Santiago. Because we couldn't compress I to Y before strong R. Santiago. And many other examples. San Diego becomes San Diego with a syllabic E. All of this sort of hangs together in a way that brings together the topics of weak vowels, vowel weakening, syllabic consonant formation, and compression. Look here, if you say, tell me a story. First of all, me has its weak form, me. Tell me a story. Now, as long as it's followed by weak schwa, then we can compress, giving tell me a story, tell me a story, tell me a story. The train is about to arrive. To has its prevocalic weak form, to ask, to eat, to arrive, which can then compress to twa. The train's about to arrive, about to arrive. But can we say, I want to ask a question? No, we can't, because there ask is a strong vowel, no compression before strong vowels. You can't say to ask. You have to say to ask. I want to ask a question. Same thing with a syllabic consonant. And has a weak form, from which we form by syllabic consonant formation. Out and about long as it's followed by weak we can get unsyllabic, non-syllabic, simple N, and say out and about, to get out and about, to get out and about. So what this tells us is that in many words, in fact, we have two possible pronunciations. We can either have a slow, uncompressed form, or we can have a quicker, compressed form. And again, this is really good news because it means it doesn't matter which you say, you can freely choose between them. But what I must point out is this block on compression if the following vowel is strong. And that again is why it's important to distinguish strong vowels from weak vowels. Here are some more examples. A couple, syllabic L, of minutes of weak form, a weak vowel. So instead of a couple of minutes, we can perfectly well say a couple of minutes. A couple of minutes ago. A couple of minutes ago. Last example is really quite complex. Neighbour, a neighbour. When it's followed by a vowel, of course it's subject to linking R. So a neighbour of ours becomes a neighbour of ours, one of our neighbours, a neighbour of ours. We've now got a followed by schwa plus R. That's a candidate for syllabic consonant formation, like gathering becoming gathering. So a neighbour of ours becomes a neighbour of ours. A neighbour of ours, this one here. And because the syllabic consonant is now followed by a weak vowel in of, it can lose its syllabicity, giving a neighbour of ours. A neighbour of ours. So we've got this chain of derivation, starting from each word, as it were, pronounced on its own, through these processes of connected speech, ending up with a typical pronunciation in connected speech. Now, it's all logical, it's all bound by rules. All rule governs, the linguists say. But this does explain, again, why people who've learnt English, particularly in its written form, are sometimes faced with difficulty in understanding spoken English, colloquial spoken English, where we typically apply these rules. And this means that in this case, well, the word neighbour has turned into a neighbour, and there are many other cases. There is also a problem in the case of compression, a problem in deciding what dictionaries should tell you, or what textbooks should tell you about the pronunciation of words. Because with some very common words, over the course of history, we have more or less forgotten the uncompressed form, and we now use only the compressed form. This is very strikingly the case in a word such as every. Now, if you look at lyrics of songs, pop music and so on, you will still often see that writing to remind you that you should say it as two syllables, every. But, to be honest, we always say this word as two syllables. Nobody normally says every. We say every. So, quite rightly, most dictionaries give it just as every and just don't tell you about the possibility of every. But in many other words that in my view could be similarly treated, we find differences between different dictionaries. So the word that is normally several, like every, normally two syllables. Nevertheless, some dictionaries do give you the form several. And it's not entirely impossible, it's not entirely obsolete, but for general purposes, general purposes, I would recommend several as the normal pronunciation. These are very common words, you see, normally compressed. Different, we don't usually say different, we say different. General, you heard me just say it. Well, these mentions here are other dictionaries that I think have got it wrong. This is the Concise Oxford Dictionary. I did do this overhead some years ago. The more recent edition might always have changed. But I think the Concise Oxford tells you this word is general, and this word is not general. This word is normally general. I'd say reference, normally compressed. I'd say factory. I'd say battery. I need a new battery in my watch. I'd say history. Though, with all of these words, one has to acknowledge that some people sometimes pronounce them with an extra syllable and say factory, battery, history. Perhaps more widespread is victory, though I think I normally say victory. Lateral, which I normally call lateral. A camera, which I normally call a camera. Federal, which I usually say is federal. And ing forms of words like bothering, which I think I usually say is bothering, not worth bothering about. There are one or two interesting cases, though, where you think all the conditions for compression are met, but nevertheless people don't compress. The name of the country, Hungary, where Hungarians live. That has a schwa followed by an R. We can say Hungary with a syllabic but can we say hungry? No, we can't. And I suppose the reason is avoidance of homophonic clash. That is, we don't want it to make it sound, we don't want to make it sound like hungry, wanting food.